Ismail of Dusalam Beats BoxingMayhem.com. I'm here with a very special guest. This man has wrote a wonderful book a couple of months ago. It's a memoir with a fantastic title called Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz. And let's not forget that bottom tagline, The Jewish Mob, A Family Affair, talking about his life growing up with the Jewish mob. And I'm speaking with none other than Alan Geik. Alan, I thank you so much for making time. I know you've been really busy on the circuit, talking with people, so I really appreciate it.
It's been really amazing. First, thank you, Ismail, for having me on your program, and I'm happy to be here. And it's been amazing because I never knew so many people were really interested in it until I was well into the writing, and I found so many social media groups devoted to organized crime of the middle 20th century. And it just amazed me that when I started to put little pieces of the book up on some of the Facebook organized crime groups, people would contact me and say, "Oh, but I thought that person did this or that." And I'd say, "Well, all I know is I used to go out to dinner with them all the time. They didn't disappear." And it's been an extraordinary adventure for me for the past few months.
That's great to hear. Yes, there's so many people. I've had my website for over 10 years. I've written about boxing, music, but the biggest article I've ever written was the one I wrote that I sent you about organized crime, the photos that I found from the 1920s and 30s of crime scenes. I still get emails about that, and people from Facebook, people repost it. It's probably in the millions now. So that I totally understand what you're saying. And with my research, one of the things that the researchers told me was that you're probably going to encounter, if you talk to any descendants, the men will be willing to open up to you, but the women will be kind of hesitant, don't want to protect the family name. And I've had some of that go on, but I looked at your situation and you didn't have that. Your sister was actually one of the people that encouraged you to write this. Can you go into how your sister kind of pushed you to put this information out there?
Well, my sister's an attorney. It's very interesting you brought that up because my sister was very close to the women back then. I wasn't that interested in their stories. I was interested more in the men's stories, and the women's stories were really more poignant in a lot of ways. I mean, the men would go to jail, they'd get out, the women would have spent 5 or 6, however many years raising the kids. The men would get out and automatically have girlfriends. And the women were really struggling in a lot of ways, no matter what ethnic group they were. That was a similar kind of experience. I think they all had. And my sister started to write a book about the women because she actually interviewed them and took notes on the interviews with some of them. So she's very much into this whole subject, and she's been amazed at the reaction she's gotten from people. NPR did a story on it, and they interviewed her about her experience when she was 12 in Las Vegas. And my Uncle George, who was the real fantastic character of organized crime in the family, he was one of the main participants, and he put a slot machine in her room and an armed guard outside. And my mother was furious because she didn't want this stuff in our lives. But my uncle, that was my sister's first experience with these kind of people.
I see. And you bring up Uncle George, he's somebody that looms large over the course of the book. One thing that I noticed about him is that he's very adaptable. Throughout all the changes that we've seen over the last 50, 60 years in America or during his time frame, he was able to pivot and kind of survive every incarnation that came about, whether it's from the government, whether it was going with the Cleveland group and getting with them. Just talk about his ingenuity that you observe, growing up with him and the life that he lived.
Well, I always thought that as I was writing the story, I realized that Uncle George and his partner throughout his whole life, Ruby Khalid, they were sort of a metaphor for organized crime. The story that I wrote starts in the early 1920s when they were 12, 13 years old, and they burglarize a dry goods store on the Lower East Side and make off with $40, which was huge. And a few silver candlesticks, which they gave to one of their friends who worked in a pawn shop and who later became one of the biggest fencers in America. And he was part of the family also. But 40 years after they climbed through the window, Ruby Collard was the president of the Desert Inn, telling Howard Hughes's people that they had to leave. And of course, Howard Hughes turned around and he bought the place. But over that 40 years, he became the president and uncle of the Desert Inn. And Uncle George became the go-to man for the Chicago mob who couldn't come into the casinos because they were on the blacklist of the casinos. So Uncle George played a really important role in that. And as you said, organized crime grew up in Prohibition, and it went through the Depression, it went through World War II, it went through post-war America. It was so adaptable that they had to be adaptable to survive. They had to see what was coming around the corner, otherwise they would lose in the biggest ways.
Absolutely. And when it comes to organized crime, with the evolution that we saw from the 1920s on, there's always, I feel like, a missing link with any evolution. And in organized crime evolution, I feel like it was Arnold Rothstein. You know, he was the one that raised a generation of criminals from Meyer, Lansky, Lucky Luciano. And you have a nice story in there about your Uncle George meeting Rothstein when he was a kid and kind of getting a little bit of an introduction about how to run and how to handle personalities, especially even handling money. Can you talk a little bit about that story? I thought that was very interesting and it kind of made a big impact on George.
Yeah, it's interesting because that was such a formative time for them. There was no television or radio, just had started. And the people on the street were the ones, I mean, they saw these real live gangsters who were older than them. Meyer, Lansky, Lucky Luciano were about 10 years older than them. And Uncle George had this story about Arnold Rothstein, who for the Jewish gangsters and the people, well, not just the Italians as well, he was the one who really organized them. And during Prohibition, and he said, why are we killing each other when there's so much money out there with Prohibition? Why don't we organize and get the trade unions? And he really took them 10 steps forward. And there's Arnold, and he came from a wealthy family, but he really had that degenerate gambler part of him where he'd rather be on his knees in an alleyway shooting dice than doing anything illegitimate. And he was the big man in the neighborhood on the Lower East Side. And the story you're referring to, Uncle George, of all 12 years old, is standing outside, and out comes Arnold Rothstein, who must have looked 9 feet tall to him, and waves him towards him and says, you know that crap game over on Hester Street? Give this to the guy who runs it. And he was like stunned. Arnold Rothstein talked to him, and when he went over to the crap game, he gave it to him, and he said, Arnold Rothstein told me to give you this. And he was always remembered, he had his name and Arnold Rothstein's in the same sentence. And to a 12-year-old, I mean, imagine that could have been Babe Ruth or Muhammad Ali. They gave me, the name is in the same sentence. So that was a very vivid memory of his 50 years later.
Wow, amazing to see. And then even with that, as large as Rothstein was, I think the way he died, as you mentioned, the degenerate gambling problem, that also had a big impact as well, not just on George, but all of the people that Rothstein was associated with. Because I feel like it showed them what not to do as far as letting your addictions or your vices ruin you, because that should not have happened to somebody of that stature for him to go out like that. So it seems like that kind of also impacted how they went about their business and the way they handled their hotels and their gambling joints going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the impression I got from when I spoke to them and they reminisced about it was that the thing they couldn't do was be who their families were. I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, but it was, they came from Italy, they came from extreme oppression in Eastern Europe, and they were going to fight and survive no matter what it took. And if they had to die doing it, they were more than willing to do that because they just couldn't live the lives of their parents. And it's interesting also because, as in all ethnic groups and criminals within the same family, one could be a judge and the other could be a crime boss. And I've always found that really interesting. Uncle George's brothers and sisters were not involved in it directly. My father was his younger brother, and Uncle George was his idol, really. Even I saw that growing up. And when Uncle George came to town, it was really a big deal because all of these people would be there. Meyer, he was an associate of Meyer Lansky's since the 20s. And the interesting thing to me, Ismail, is that it didn't seem like that big of a deal back at the time. It became much bigger with time in a weird sort of way. These guys were just doing what they do. And when I saw them, I knew who they were, but I never could have imagined that they would have the kind of interest, as I mentioned earlier, 50 and 70 years later. That to me is still extraordinary.
Absolutely. And you brought up a good point about them saying that they didn't want to kind of go the same path that their parents did. And it made me think about the whole idea of, I guess, Jewish masculinity. I feel like it was under attack, especially after all that oppression with the pogroms. You saw that in Russia. A lot of people were looking down on Jewish men, feeling like they didn't protect their families, which wasn't true. And I feel like the sons made sure to fight against that, especially with the Nazis. A lot of people don't realize that there were swastikas that were flowing outside of Madison Square Garden at one point in time, and that there were also Nazi camps, less than 100 miles away from Manhattan, that a lot of those gangsters made sure to get rid of. Can you talk about the pride that they have to make sure that they fought for not just what was theirs, but also their lineage to make sure that wasn't exploited anymore in the New World?
One of the, I remember hearing this directly, but as I did research for the book, I realized that there were a lot of Jewish newspapers, there still are, and they were really conflicted because here were men for the first time fighting anti-Semitism, which they couldn't and didn't do as much in Eastern Europe, but they were fighting on the street, but at the same time, they were exploiting their own people. They were exploiting the shopkeepers. The union laborers were being taken advantage of by mob control. We all know that of the union. So there was always that conflict in the community that I was aware of. But as I pointed out, even with Henry Ford at the beginning of the 20th century and right after the war, Henry Ford was one of the most virulent anti-Semites in American history. And he pointed to Jewish criminality in Detroit, which was interesting because Michigan had prohibition 2 years before became a federal offense, or it was outlawed. And so he was pointing out that these Jewish gangs were taking all the booze from Canada on ships, but they were also fighting the Henry Ford Nazis on the picket line because there was a lot of labor strife at that time. And it really violated Henry Ford's vision of who these Jewish men were. They were supposed to be little men behind the scenes, manipulating other ethnic groups to doing what they were. Either they were communists or they were bankers. I never could understand how they could be both things. But that was the vision. And when they were out on the street, they saw that these men were really a battle for them. And they were the Jewish gangsters, and which spread out to more than just gangsters, really relished fighting these guys who didn't relish the fight as much as they did. And in the street, the one who's really into the fight is going to be the one who generally wins. So that's my view. But that persisted right through, and it's still existing now. But I remember them always talking about fighting the Nazis closer to World War II. And as you mentioned, and I wrote about it in the book, in 1939, there was a huge Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. There were 20,000 Nazis in Madison Square Garden. And the mayor, who's Fiorello LaGuardia, was half Jewish, but he insisted that the rally take place because of freedom of speech. But he hired 1,500 cops to go around. But as soon as the war started, the people who organized that rally were in jail. They were in jail as enemy combatants or whatever the charges were. And very few people cared if they were genuine charges or not. But that's always been a theme throughout the Jewish mob and not mob, that there were those two strains of you're exploiting us, but you're also protecting us from the people that historically have always been our oppressor.
Right. And I think that's always the balance that you kind of have with a community. I don't know if you ever watched The Wire. They had a line in there from this famous confrontation between a cop and a street guy. And the cop was saying, no matter how bad the neighborhood was, we always had a community. Everybody kind of knew their role. And he mentioned a case where he, as a child, wanted to be out in the streets, and the rough guys, the gangsters, they wouldn't let him. They said, no, you're on the straight and narrow. You're good at school. You don't need to be here. And that reminded me exactly what happened with your father. He wanted to be out there in the streets, but your Uncle George and everyone, Uncle Charlie said, absolutely not. So even then they knew, that he had something different in a different path, and they looked out for him. I thought that was a great story that you told.
Yeah, and they got in my father's face and said, this is not where you're going, because they knew the risks. And it was funny because my father, when he was 16, got a job as a messenger, delivering sheet music for a music publishing company. And his nickname quickly became Bim. And where did Bim come from? It came from one of the cartoons that were in the newspaper. I think it was Little Orphan Annie, but I'm not sure of that. But he was the only one who had a legitimate job in that group of people. So my father was, and he remained that way, even though he prospered later in his life because he was able to start a garment center trucking company. And you couldn't do that unless you had really, really high level backing, which he did through Uncle George, Uncle Charlie, and the other characters of the other extended family. So he prospered from it, and we all did in one way or another by tickets to basketball games. I mean, one of the men who I mentioned owned most of the bars in the 60s and 70s. He was very close to my brother, and when I saw him one time, his name was Matty the Horse, and he owned maybe 200 bars, and his partner was Benny Cohen. The two of them, Italian and Jewish guys from 1955. I have a picture of Benny in the book at 1955, and my father and I at Matty's bar when Matty suggested my father retire. But these, they really had a sense. Well, Matty, I'm sorry, I got off. Matty said to me, we do the garbage pickup for Madison Square Garden. And if you ever want tickets, just call me up. I get better tickets than the players' wives.
Wow.
And so that was sort of a benefit for me, having those people around. But I never saw it as a possibility for me to even think of being in that environment.
And that's always something that stood out to me because, as we know, with the Italian lineage, that is something that we can see passed down. We saw it with Gotti, his sons got into it. But with Jewish gangsters, it was really almost like a one-generation phenomenon. It's not something that it seemed like they wanted to pass on to their children. They felt like they had to do this to get ahead, but that was not what they wanted for their children. I kind of see that across the board, throughout their families.
That's absolutely true as a generalization, because there were many Italians who I knew whose fathers were organized crime, and they were like totally prohibited from even being close to it. But as a generalization, that's true because most of the Jewish gangsters, they wanted their kids to go to Yale to be lawyers and doctors. And right next, my uncle George's best friend's sons became lawyers, and he was in the same business. But they never want. My mother they never wanted it passed on. And my mother once said, "Jews don't raise their children to be gangsters." And she didn't say it in any deprecatory way because the Italians and the Jews were really extremely tight throughout the 20th century, but also in Italy, as I pointed out, unlike every other country, the Italians really protected the Jews in their community to the point of standing up to the Gestapo. And I wrote in my book that at one point the Gestapo chief in Rome wired back to Berlin, and he said, "I don't understand. These Italians are not just passive, but they're aggressively resisting us rounding up Jews." And my mother was in tears when she didn't know of that quote, but she knew of the reality of that relationship. Yeah.
So here's something that's interesting that I wanted to bring to your attention. The book that I'm working on is focused on four brothers. Last name is Amberg, the Amberg brothers. They were pretty infamous during their time in Brownsville. They controlled that area. So I did a lot of research at the municipal archives. You know, they were pretty much exterminated by 1935. And there's a list there of crimes or murders that were solved based on Abe Rellis, his testimony. So when I was going down the list, and I can send this to you later, I was looking at the names of who got my subjects. And the last brother that got killed, the names that were down there were Mendy Weiss and Red Levine. Essentially, he was close with Red, apparently, and they had went to dinner. He said, "Let's go in the back room." And then when he went in the back room, hatchet came out, and somehow his skull got split in two. So I always found that interesting because, you know, Red has always been around. You know, he's has this mythical image of being so pious, not killing on the Sabbath. You kind of debunk that. So just going to your memories of him actually knowing the man in his later years.
Yeah. Well, there was always he was one of the few, as you said, he was pious in that he wore a yarmulke under his fedora, but he was in a lot of ways the toughest and most ruthless in a lot of senses. But it was funny because he picked up with my mother's best friend. And my mother, Sylvia, who I've mentioned, and there were photos of her, she became his girlfriend from 1951 till the time he passed away in the mid 1970s. I can't recall the date right now. But to me, it was like Sylvia telling my mother all of the problems she had with Red, just like any woman might relate to her best friend from high school. And it was more like this guy, Red, he was sort of humanized in a weird sort of way. When we'd see them, I'd know some of the backstory. My sister knew a lot more of the backstory because she would hear it from Sylvia directly, and I wouldn't. But Red did have a mythical image because of the some of the half-truths, like it was said for many years that he would never kill on the Sabbath, which was Saturday. And my Uncle George, who knew him very well, actually did a job with him, as I pointed out, said, "Oh no, Red will kill anybody on any day if the price is right." And that was the sense, that the sort of amused sense of interaction that I heard from these men my whole life. There was a certain what would you call it? A lack of total seriousness. This is just what they did.
All right. And going back to what you talked about as far as community, when I was doing some research, I talked to this guy. His name is Sanford Smith. I think he does interior designs and things like that up in New York. And he mentioned that his father, who was an undertaker, he had Red on the payroll to make sure that he showed employment. And it reminded me when you were talking about your story, how when Charlie Workman, when he got locked up, how your family was making sure that his family still got the money that needed to sustain them while he was locked up. Just going to how that process actually happened, kind of that how civilians can work hand in hand with the underworld like that.
Well, there was no social security to begin with, and a lot of these men did their worked in the 30s and 40s into the 50s. They were getting older. They were being, as I pointed out several times in the book, organized crime was the biggest cash flow industry in American history. So they were always able to take care of their own. I grew up in the Bronx, and there were throughout the Bronx, in my building too, single men and women who lived in like a one-bedroom modestly. They were being taken care of by the mob because maybe their husband was killed or in jail, and a man might have been retired or no longer active. But we knew those people in the neighborhood. They were quiet, they lived quiet lives, but there was a very vibrant social security system in place for the mob affiliates throughout those years. And Uncle Charlie's family was taken care of throughout his 23 years in incarceration in New Jersey. And my father, because he was a civilian, and he had no criminal history. He was one of many people that would bring money to Charlie's family, which Charlie was always extremely grateful for, because they supported the family for 23 years to one degree or another.
Right, right. And for those who might not know why Charlie was locked up, of course, the title kind of gives it away, just in case you Schultz for that murder. When I looked at the records in the municipal archives, it confirmed everything that you said as far as when the hit happened. Charlie starts going through Dutch Schultz's pockets to try and get money. Mindy Weiss's argument was that this is a personal matter now. This isn't a professional thing that we came for. I'm out of here. So he leaves Charlie there, and Charlie has to walk all the way back from Newark to Brooklyn. So of course he's heated. It's even in the police NYPD records. They had, he was arguing with him about it, and Lepke told him just let it go. The funny thing is, when I was looking at the records as far as any murders tied to Charlie Workman, there really wasn't anything substantial. It was really that one Dutch Schultz thing. The one time that he talked a little bit too much, that's what got him jammed up, it looks like, unfortunately.
Yeah, I read many accounts of how many people were murdered by Murder Incorporated, or anyone in particular. I never took those numbers to be really serious, because even when my father was alive and that numbers came up, he would just say, who knows? I mean, nobody really knows. And Charlie was supposedly one of the go-to hitmen, and that made sense because this was a mob boss they were taking out, not some numbers runner who was skimming off the top. This was Dutch Schultz, after all, and they had to make it good. And so they picked Charlie and Mindy Weiss, who Mindy has wound up being executed in Sing Sing in the World War II era for another murder of a small candy store owner. Ironically, it wasn't a big mob boss that he went to the electric chair for, but a candy store owner.
Right, right. I think his last name was Rosen, if I remember.
That's correct.
And just to give you a little bit more trivia, the Dutch 24 hours before they killed Schultz, Mindy Weiss, I told you about him and Red Levine, they had killed the person I told you about that I'm researching, Louis Amberg. So within 24 hours, he did those two murders within a day of each other to show you how active they were back then.
Oh, I'm sure there was so many. I mean, this was their enforcement team. They didn't have legal divisions like corporations did. And one of the other factors of that always interested me was that they built organized crime by overlapping their interests, diversifying their interests. I remember one of the gangsters, Trigger Mike Coppola, who took over for Dutch Schultz's numbers racket in Harlem and in the Bronx. He sold part of it to Meyer Lansky's operation in Florida, and the Cleveland people had pieces of everything. And I'm sure this was replicated throughout the country. And they were able to really keep this going without having big legal teams like General Motors has to sue people. They had Murder Incorporated instead. And as I joked with my brother at one time, they didn't need corporate lawyers, they needed defense attorneys. So, but they built this extraordinary cash flow business.
And you mentioned about, they were taking over the rackets that Dutch Schultz himself had taken over from Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson, the Black Gangsters there.
Right.
As you know, the big thing now, there's a show called Godfather in Harlem, which kind of dramatizes what happened afterward between Bumpy Johnson and the mob and everything. I'm wondering if you ever got any stories about that. I know it's highly dramatized, and most people would say that there wasn't any conflict like that between Bumpy Johnson. He's essentially working for the mob at that point. But I'm wondering if his name ever came up in any of the stories from any of the guys.
I knew of his name early on, but I really have no specific story about it. Even my brother had mentioned him. My brother was a detective, as I mentioned in the book, who got himself into a big serious police scandal. But as far as Bumpy Johnson and all of it was such a profitable business, and when it was run by Black and Latino people, they put a lot of money into the community in there. Once Prohibition came to an end, the white mobsters were looking for another business, and they were tipped off to this huge they were, in a lot of senses, they weren't even aware of it. Or how big it was. But once they went after it, they had the judges, they had the police and all of that. So the outcome of that was going to be pretty clear. They wound up taking it over throughout the country. That would be about in the mid-30s and early 30s. A very interesting time in American history, because Prohibition just ended and they went to gambling overnight. And the numbers and all the illegal casinos in Ohio that Uncle George walked into and his other partners and kept going for 35 years, 25 years, as it was huge cash flow.
Absolutely. One thing about Levine that you had mentioned is that he had, I think, a restaurant or a social club called The Spot, which was on Grand Street.
It was a bar on Grand Street in Manhattan, which was on the Lower East Side. It was a few blocks from where my parents grew up. And when we'd visit my grandmother on Sundays, my father would take me and my sister, my brother over. That was his idea of a Sunday in the park, was to go to Red Levine's The Spot. There was also another mob place called the French Romanian, which was a little higher end, but The Spot was Red's bar. And it was really exciting for me to go in there as a really young boy, because it was the first days of watching baseball, and I was a real avid Yankee fan, and later on a boxing fan on Gillette boxing. And I could sit at the bar and have all the Coca-Cola I wanted and pretzels and whatever I wanted. Nobody cared. It was just load him up and keep him quiet. So it was a really exciting time. And Red had a very gruff exterior, and he was really a gruff in some of his manners. But I always found that he had a certain charm, if I may say, to us as young kids. And Sylvia, his lady, went through what most of the women went through with gangsters of that era, and probably still today.
Right. Now, the reason why Grand Street stuck in my mind when I was doing research on my subjects when the War of the Jews, quote unquote, happened between Waxy Gordon and Meyer Lansky and all them, there was some type of hideout that Meyer and Siegel had on Grand Street, and it was firebombed by somebody associated with Waxy Gordon. The top of the building caved in. Siegel was knocked out. They had to take him to the hospital. And that's actually, apparently, I've heard that's the inspiration for the Godfather scene where Godfather's in the hospital and Michael's outside and they're rolling by. That was,
Oh,
they
I
said,
didn't
they
know
said
that.
that they was inspired by that, yeah. So the story goes that while Siegel was there, Red Levine and some other guys, they conferred with him and they eventually went and killed the guy that put the firebomb down there. They dressed up as cops to do it. So they think that might have been the origin of what Red used later on when they killed Maranzano, when they came as IRS agents.
Yes.
This happened in 1932. So, well, actually afterwards, maybe they learned from Maranzano to
Yes, that could
kill
be.
again, right? So that was really interesting that his spot there was on Grand Street. I'm pretty sure he had fond memories. That might have been the reason why he set up there again, decades later after what happened with that firebombing. But now that we've mentioned that, you talked about that also in your book, the whole conflict between Waxy Gordon. It's never really been said why he didn't get along with Meyer Lansky. I heard they got into a fist fight at one point. Probably just an age thing because
Yeah.
Waxy was so much older than them. But talk about, your memories and what you discussed in the book about that whole war that went on.
Uh, Waxy Gordon was older than Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano. I believe he could never accept. He was one of the people. They were organizing crime, making it into almost a corporate structure. And he and Dutch Schultz, Maranzano, Mazzaria, these guys were on these guys could never be part of that. This was like a new era. And Waxy Gordon always had an animosity towards Meyer Lansky because Meyer was the highest level Jew in the group. And as it turned out, they went to war with each other in many ways. And at the end of the day, they set up Waxy Gordon with he wound up getting a 10-year tax evasion charge. And one of the guys who was very close to Waxy Gordon then, and later on in 1951, when Waxy got busted for a drug deal, one of the men who was with him was a man named Sammy Cassup. And Sammy, to us, was the most hardened criminal of all of them. And he was the closest one to us. He loved my mother. He loved my parents. He worked for my father in the garment center. And he was very close to Fat Tony Salerno. I mean, all of this, there's FBI reports. And there's a picture of Sammy getting busted in 1951 with Waxy Gordon. And according to him, and he would be the best source, Waxy just couldn't accept any kind of involved collaboration with anyone else. He wanted to run his own business, and that was counter to what they were trying to do. So they took him out. Unlike Dutch Schultz, who they killed, he wound up in jail for a significant amount of time.
Right, right. And we talked about, we're going to go into your Meyer Lansky story. You actually personally met the man. So I wanted to talk first about Ben Siegel. He's another person from movies and media that kind of has a larger than life persona, but the stereotype about him has always been, he's trigger happy, he's bloodthirsty. But just looking at his history to get to where he got, as far as being so respected as a leader of the combination in the mob, he had to have had smarts, especially what happened with Las Vegas. But the way that it ended for him, I feel like that's kind of damaged his rep, so to speak. He's almost kind of like a Mark Antony type figure, the way things went with Virginia Hill. But I'm wondering, the guys that you associated with, how did they speak about him in later years, if they did? Based on, I'm wondering if maybe they didn't because of how things turned out.
I can't recall too many conversations about him other than what has become public knowledge, like how he was assumed to skim money from the Flamingo, and that was the basis for him getting rubbed out. And it took a lot of work because he was such a high-level figure and so close to Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano for so many years. But I didn't really hear too much about Bugsy Siegel. But what I do remember was the nicknames that a lot of the people had. My father always pointed out, like Charlie the Bug, that was Charlie Workman, Uncle Charlie's nickname. I never, of course, heard him called that, or I would certainly, I was aware of that name out there, but according to my father, a lot of them were carried more in newspapers because not only was there Bugsy Siegel, but there was a man named Bugsy Goldstein, who was one of the people who was caught up in Murder Incorporated, A.B. Relis, that era.
Right.
And Bugsy Goldstein's, the newspaper spelt it with 2 G's, and Bugsy Siegel was spelt with 1 G. And my father's attitude was, do you think they really know how they spell these nicknames? But I think the story was pretty straightforward about Bugsy Siegel, except for who actually did it. And I had no more information about that it could have been his lady friend, Virginia Hill's brother, who was angry and he was a sharpshooter. And it didn't seem like it was done the way mafia hits would be done, like through a window.
Right.
That it was a little too, usually they're like in your face, supposedly. But I really can't offer too much more than that about it. It never really came up in all of the conversations I had.
Now, one thing you did uncover about that surprised me when they had all the conferences in Havana to decide what to do with him about the skimming and everything. The narrative has always been that it was Meyer Lansky that was, defending him and trying to prevent that from happening. But I thought the story was also that he was the one that found out about the skimming and brought it back. But in your case, you found out that Mo Dalitz, he was the one that actually knew about that and brought it back to the entire group. That was something I didn't know about before. So I always wondered if that caused any strife between Mo and Meyer. Probably not. But I'm wondering if you knew anything or heard anything about their dynamics and how all that went down.
Well, actually, according to a lot of people that I had referred to that, Meyer Lansky always thought of Mo Dalitz as his equal, because he was such an extraordinary money earner in Cleveland from 1930, just about the time that Meyer and Lucky Luciano took over the mob and organized it. For the next 20 years, Mo Dalitz was a huge earner and partner in so many different places in Havana, which they had just opened with Batista in the mid-30s, and they put in a huge amount of money with Meyer. And he had the highest regard for Mo Dalitz. And one of the sidebars to the Bugsy Siegel story that I heard when I was younger, and then as I was researching the book, I did see some indication of it, was that Mo Dalitz was also involved romantically with Virginia Hill. And there was enough to believe that. And I remember hearing that when I was younger, but it didn't really resonate at the time, like what that meant in the whole picture. But that he being Mo Dalitz, saw Las Vegas as a huge opportunity. And it was in his interest to present Bugsy Siegel and Virginia Hill in the worst light possible, that being that they had Swiss bank accounts, that they were implying that they were skimming money. So it was in his interest, and Meyer had such regard for him that he was someone he listened to in great detail. He listened to him, and how that played out at the end and how that affected anyone's decision, I really can't say.
Got it. And you did mention boxing earlier, so I'm pretty sure you may have heard this story in passing regarding Mo Dalitz. There was always this story that at some point, him and Sonny Liston had gotten into some type of argument, and he basically told Sonny, not in these words, of course, but if you lay a finger on me, you're dead. And that's always been speculated as maybe one of the reasons something happened to Sonny, that it wasn't just a drug overdose. But I'm wondering if you heard anything about that, number one. And then number two, we also know in boxing, it's the red light district of sports. It's always been corrupt, and there's always been fixed fights in some form or fashion. I'm just wondering if you've heard any potential fixed fights that somebody might have mentioned that we may not be aware of.
not on that level of, but I mentioned in the book that I used to work out in a gym called Stillman's Gym, which was a famous gym at the time. And I was 17 years old. I didn't know anything any better, but and I wasn't aware of it at the time. They knew who Uncle George was because Uncle George had a very big role in Cleveland and in boxing. And he even made my father the name of, this you'll find it interesting. In 1951, 52, my father took me and my brother to a fight in the old St. Nicholas Arena. Why? Because he was named the manager of a man named Jimmy Bivens.
Really?
And
Great fighter.
my father was listed as the manager of Jimmy Bivens because Jimmy Bivens' the people behind him couldn't be listed. And we went to the fight where Jimmy Bivens was knocked out by a man named Archie Moore. And there's a famous picture of Archie Moore standing over Jimmy Bivens. And I have that in my recollection for all these years. But that was even younger then. But when I went to the gym, I remember that there was always the implication of fights being fixed on the Gillette Friday night fights. How could they not have been after all? I mean, someone needed an edge. With the small amount, I mean, when you consider that the amount of gambling on those fights was a fraction of what tomorrow night's betting would be. So, anyway, that was, but as far as Mo Dalitz and the Sonny Liston racial interaction that they had allegedly, I don't really know too much more about that, except for the fact that Cleveland was always a place where Sugar Ray Robinson fought there, lots of the great fighters of that era, and they all needed to have some kind of approval at the time. I'm talking about 30s and 40s.
Right, that's true. That's true. Now, as far as the guys that you mentioned him briefly, we didn't get his name out there. Johnny Eder, the Fence. You said he's very pivotal in a lot of the stories that you were able to develop for this book. And I feel he was in a good position. You're in the thick of things, but not quite. So I feel he was like in a safe spot where he can kind of observe everybody without really having to get directly involved in murders and things like that. Just talk about his overall memory and how he was able to get all these stories to you, so many decades later.
Well, Johnny Eder grew up with my father, Uncle George, Charlie, Johnny Diaguardi, who was an Italian guy who wound up becoming a major mafia influence in New York. And I have pictures of my father with him that we've had in our family ever since I could remember. But Johnny Eder was the only one in that whole group who was not violent. I don't believe he would ever have been violent. He was, as I pointed out, sort of jokingly, but it was true. He went to museums when he was a teenager, and that made him different right away from everybody else. But he was interested in jewelry and art, and he wound up becoming one of the big fences, working out of the mayor's city hall in Manhattan, in the Brooklyn DA's office. But Johnny had an extremely interesting take on everything because it's an interesting question because he was the one who was closest to us in a lot of ways. My sister was very close to him as well. And it was always a joke because if I wanted a piece of jewelry, a woman I knew in the 80s had cancer, and I was going to visit her, and I knew she had a favorite stone. So I asked Johnny, do you have this stone? And he said, let me go look. And he brought back this huge necklace. It was heavy. It was silver and lapis. And I said, I have to pay you. And he said, no, I can't take your money. I said, no, otherwise I don't want it. She said, okay, give me $100. So I did. I found out it was worth like $4,000. But he always said it was, oh yeah, this is from my late wife's jewelry, but we knew it wasn't. But he had a really good insight because he was so well respected by all of these people, maybe because he wasn't violent, maybe because he was there and they knew him their whole life, but somehow he had a different aura to those people, and they really confided in him. And he lived longer than everyone else, so that made a difference too. I was asking him lots of questions right up until probably the mid-90s or so, and his recollection was faultless. And my brother was funny piece. My brother had been a detective, so he had a way of talking to all of them, and their response to him was they treated him in a more comradely kind of way than me, because at that point, when my brother was a detective, the police department was so incredibly corrupt, and they didn't think a detective was someone who they should concern themselves with. They knew the higher ups in the police department. They didn't have to worry about that. So my brother had an interesting time asking them questions, and they opened up to him. And Johnny was always one to be very, very vivid in his recollections.
And you mentioned your brother Bernard. He did get in some trouble as far as the special units he was in and the corruption that got exposed. But it seems like after that, he almost gained a little bit more respect among the underworld circles. Can you talk about how that went down as far as how he handled the arrest and the aftermath of the scandals being exposed?
Yeah, well, to go back a little bit, the French Connection started the whole process off. The two New York detectives made a bust of French movie TV host or whatever, and they got a big amount of heroin. The police department in the mid-60s decided, why don't we have the special unit of detectives that go after just the big guys? My brother, because my Uncle George had so many connections in the police department, my brother was on the fast track to being a detective. And I wrote about that in the book as well. But he wound up in the Special Investigations Unit. There were 75 detectives, but immediately they wound up shaking down the big dealers. Right. And they wound up just arresting small-time dealers. And the whole thing blew up when one of the leaders of those group became an informant and turned lots of people in. And out of that came the book, The Prince of the City, which was a well-known movie and book. And my brother was featured in the book, not in the movie. They didn't use any of the real names, but he didn't give anyone up. He was arrested, and a lot of the police didn't give people up. My brother wound up having a misdemeanor later on, and it took years to get his gun permit, because when he took over my father's trucking business, security was one of his specialties. So he needed a gun, and it took him years to get it back. But the fact that he didn't give anyone up in that world said a lot, because he would have never been able to function in the garment center of that era. I'm talking about the 70s and 80s if he informed on any of the police, either by the police or by the mob. That was just, you just didn't do that.
Right, right. There's a quote from Ben Siegel that sticks in my mind. There was some incident where he was getting upset, his anger was flashing, and it was towards somebody that wasn't in the mob, and the person was afraid. And he basically told them, "Don't worry, we only kill each other," essentially. And that seems to be the modus operandi for most cases. And most people kind of looked at prohibition and all that as a victimless crime. But there was a turning point where that changed, where I believe his name was Irvin Penn that you talked about. He was killed by accident. And that kind of flipped the whole perception of organized crime. Can you talk a little bit about how you discuss that in the book?
Sure. Organized crime was looked at in 1939 when the incident happened that you're referring to. Throughout Prohibition, it was organized crime bringing booze to every community in the country. They weren't their enemies. And then it became gambling in numbers. And so organized crime had a pass in the community. They weren't seen as their enemy in a lot of ways. But in 1939, Lepke, who was the leader of Murder Incorporated, was being hounded, and he wound up being executed a few years later. But he wanted to take out one of the union officials who was supposedly informing on him. And they sent a team to stake out this man, Irving Penn's apartment in the Bronx. And the man who was watching him was Cuppy Mignon, who was later on so close to us because actually he gave me my first job in the Painters Union, which you really had to be connected to get into. He helped get me that. But Cuppy pointed out the wrong man, Irving Penn, not the man, I think his name was Philip Orlovsky, who was a union official, and they took him out. And Irving Penn, and his last words supposedly were, "I don't have an enemy in the world." And very quickly, the newspapers picked up on it, and as often happens, public opinion changed very quickly. And within a few months, Brooklyn had a new district attorney, William O'Dwyer, who was born in Ireland. He was a worker, a laborer. He became a policeman, went to law school, and became the DA of Brooklyn. And he was the one who set out to stop all the murders in New York. And then through that, they uncovered this combination, which was not called Murder Incorporated until A.B. Relis informed on them. And when they found out all of these murders were happening under a couple of people's leadership, they called a newspaper reporter called it Murder Incorporated, and the name stuck. But that murder of Irving Penn changed public opinion overnight. And Cuppy wound up being on the run for a few years. He had some surgery done, plastic surgery. And years later, we knew him our whole life. And we always knew that story about him. But what was also interesting, Ismail, that you brought it up, was that when people like Uncle Charlie came out of jail, they had no animosity towards him. He was just one of the gang who was never really that successful or never really reached that echelon of criminality. Because even when he was watching the Irving Penn's building, he was a low-level Murder Incorporated wannabe.
Right. There's a quote that's attributed to Lucky Luciano, where they asked him if he had everything to do all over again, how would he do it? And he said he'd do the same things, but he would do it legally because he realized too late that it's just as easy to make a honest million as a crooked one. So it makes me wonder, when you were talking with all these older guys in their older years, did you sense at any point any remorse for anything that they had done, or wishing they had taken a different path? One thing that made me think that might be a possibility is that story about Charles Workman when he was talking about Moses. It made me wonder if he was thinking anything about his spiritual life. Even though he doubted the whole Moses story and everything and the mythology behind it, it made me think maybe he was contemplating, where his soul might be going.
There was a lot of philosophical comments that I heard, but I mean about life and organized crime. But one of the things that always struck me was that almost all of them in some way said, well, we were all poor. We came, parents, or they came as babies to America, oppressed, Italians, Jews, and they had that outlet, so they became criminals. When in fact, as I pointed out in the book, my father I remember said, well, look at it this way, George Gershwin and Meyer Lansky were the same age. And one grew up in Brooklyn on one side of the Williamsburg Bridge, and Meyer grew up on the Manhattan side of it. And when they were 24 years old, George Gershwin wrote Rhapsody in Blue, and Meyer Lansky became a mob boss. So there were other outlets. There were Supreme Court Judge Felix Frankfurter came from that area. But it was counter to the reality of you didn't really have to be a criminal to be a successful businessman. And I understand what Lucky Luciano's comment was, because he had to go through jail. He went through jail. He served close people around him murdered. So it would have been, and he saw how close, I believe, I can't say what he saw, but a lot of them saw organized crime and politics and straight business as all being the same. There were just different levels of hypocrisy involved in it. That someone like a Henry Ford, who was a great contributor to American culture with the Model T and what have you, but yet they had their own racism, anti-Semitism, that they were no better or worse. I'm sure criminals today feel exactly the same way, looking at the political hypocrisy out there, regardless of how they feel about the politicians. But I just felt that, as I mentioned before, there was always that sense that they built a business by diversifying their assets, and it was what corporate America was doing 20 and 30 years later. Diversification on Wall Street, they're always pitching that to people to become, to invest in, diversify. They were doing this in the 20s because, for one reason, in case one of their operations went down, they always had income from other ones. And so if Trigger Mike's New York numbers operation went down, well, he had money from Meyer's casinos in Florida, or Mo Dalitz's casinos in Ohio.
Absolutely. So to conclude, almost forgot, we have to hear your Meyer Lansky story, being that you met the man. Somebody, we've seen shows like Boardwalk Empire, makes him seem so much larger than life, but you have a very down-home story about him that I wanted you to share before we get out.
And again, it points out some of the things we were touching on, is that these guys were they were part of they were part of the scene, and they became much larger in life once social media came around, I believe, and movies like Casino and The Godfather and Sopranos, they added a lot to these people's aura. But the story you're referring to was when my Uncle George came to town, he would often stay at the Essex House or the Hampshire House, which were truly elegant to us coming from the Bronx. And they'd always be filled with men with cigars and cigarettes and booze and around. It was really thrilling to go. And one of the times I went there was a man sitting at the window, and in a shirt, I remember it was open, and it was Meyer Lansky. And I knew who he was, but he was like the boss, and you could tell by, and he said to me, do you want a pastrami sandwich? And I forget how that came up. My father introduced me to him. I was very polite, as we always were. I'm sure I called him Mr. Lansky. And he said, I said, no, I shook my head. He said, well, then you'll share one with me. And he took an order, and he told me to go to the Stage Deli, and you know where it is? And I said, yeah. He says, don't use my name. It's in there, and pick it up. And I came back, and the story took on some life in our family, because if somebody, my brother became a detective years later. He said, well, I got my detective's badge. I said, yeah, but I had a pastrami sandwich with Meyer Lansky. That would be sort of a family joke, not often, but once in a while. And I realized, Ismail, that right at that time, and we're talking probably about the summer of 1958, Uncle George was one of the operators of the casino, the Havana Nacional Casino.
Yeah, right.
And he saw that the end was happening because of what was happening on the streets. Not him alone, but Meyer didn't see it that way, because he was dealing with the Batista and the generals. Oh, everything's fine, but the story on the street, as often happens, was quite different. And George and another man named Sam Tucker, and I have the FBI reports, so I wasn't, I put them in there because I found them fascinating. And Uncle George was negotiating with Meyer Lansky's brother at that time. So that was one of the reasons Meyer was probably there. And also, he supposedly had an apartment at the hotel, Meyer. had an apartment, and he was dressed very casual. He might have come from across the hall for all I know, just to see and hang out with some of his old friends. That's how laid back the whole situation was.
Right. And the interesting thing about that is maybe in a different lifetime, if that had happened 30, 40 years earlier, that might have been your George Rothstein moment.
That's true.
Like you had been born in a different generation. So very, very interesting story. I just want to let people know before we go, we did not touch on everything that's in this book. You know, there's CIA conspiracies, a lot of other things in here. So make sure you check this out. We just kind of scratched the surface. Wonderful book, Alan Geik, Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz, available wherever you buy your favorite books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can get it anywhere. Any last words before we go?
All I could say is thank you for bringing my book to your audience's attention, really. And I know we could probably talk 2 more hours about some of the other stories. And I'm thrilled to have spent this time with you. And I hope you have a great time tomorrow night at the fight. Who do you like? If you could.
Oh, it's a good fight. I'm sticking with David Benavidez. I think he's too big and too long. Caleb Plant has good footwork, so he can move around the ring, but you have to engage at some point. And the issue that I have is that even though it's a super middleweight fight, I think David Benavidez, when he puts the weight on, he's probably going to come into the ring as a cruiserweight.
That's right.
He's going to be huge. It's going to be hard to hurt him and hard to keep him off of him because, you know, Caleb had problems keeping Canelo off of him. And Canelo's a lot smaller than Benavidez. So I'm thinking Benavidez late knockout.
Well, so it's an exciting time to come to Las Vegas when there's a big fight on. So I hope you have a great time tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.